Rabbi Tovia singer, Dr. Robert M. Price, kick it again here at Myth Vision Podcast. You don't find this stuff everywhere, guys. I'm really glad that these two connected and became really good friends. Today they're going to be talking about how the New Testament reuses Old Testament fulfillments and really reinterprets the meaning, what Christians like to call, double fulfillment. Well, we enjoy having Rabbi's take on coming at the New Testament here and getting his angle as a rabbinic Jew. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comment section. Hit that like button. Guys, you could join our Patreon and get all early access of all the videos that I ever produce here at Myth Vision, and I appreciate all the support I can get. Thank you. We are Myth Vision. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. Dr. Robert M. Price and Rabbi Tovia Singer joining us again today. This is obviously a fantastic interview. We've had the last two interviews were amazing, literally amazing. And so I figure let's do another one. Let's talk about some of prophecies that are fabricated, obviously in these mythological gospels. Strangely written in a way to act as though these are fulfillments of a lot of the Hebrew scriptures. And I know that you, being someone who does outreach in Judaism and constantly combating Christian apologists who are trying to convert Jews specifically, that's your mission, they're using these texts that are coming from the Hebrew Bible. And I wanted to throw a couple out there. Maybe we can rabbit trail and go from there. It's like Isaiah 53. That's a big one. The idea, the context that they're quoting comes from an entirely different historical period, and then they're like ripping it out and say double fulfillment, and they're throwing it in the New Testament. There's also some scriptures that they manipulate to mean different things you have suggested. So I'd like to get you to take us off, Rabbi.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting issue. It was vital for the church to establish that Jesus is not just the Christ, but he is the fulfillment of clear prophecies in the Jewish scriptures. And fundamentalists will frequently say Jesus fulfilled hundreds of prophecies. As it turns out, strangely, that Matthew, we're going to find out in a moment, will engage in this kind of fulfilling scripture more than any of the other gospels. But I'm going to tell you something now, and then we're going to actually see it, that if the book of Matthew had never been written, many more Jews might have converted to Christianity. Strangely, if we take the mainstream view that the author of the book of Matthew wrote his work for the Jews to convert them to Christianity, this is one of the strangest twists in history, because as it turned out, because Matthew engaged in manipulating the Jewish scriptures in order to make it appear Christological, and what he did was so transparent, so naked, that it prevented Jews from possibly getting involved in Christianity that might have otherwise got involved in it. So Matthew, I want to take out a moment and thank Matthew. Thank you so much for doing this, because if you never wrote this, if you didn't engage in this kind of chicanery and this kind of naked fraud, this is not even subtle. The only reason why Christians don't get this, they're not stupid. It's just they really don't read the Jewish Bible. They read 5 texts, they memorize that, and that's all they read. So as a result of it, they have no idea. But Matthew saved us. And strangely, I just an annotation, we'll go straight to it. There's another writer in the Christian Bible who quotes the Jewish scriptures extensively, and that's Paul. And what is striking is that although Matthew is really the great failure among the contributors to the Christian canon, because of his book and his supposed fulfillment citations prevented Jews from doing exactly what he wanted them to do, Paul, on the other hand, had the benefit of writing for a non-Jewish audience, and therefore his audience could not read Hebrew, had no access to the Jewish scriptures, certainly not the Hebrew, couldn't detect the difference between chaff and wheat, and embrace Paul's teachings. So whereas Paul is writing for a Gentile audience, and the Gentiles went for it, they had no way of checking out Romans 10, Romans 11. It's just a nightmare. But no Gentile could know it. But Matthew, the Jews could look at and go, "Oh, this is complete nonsense. We want nothing to do with it." So yeah, so that's the subtext of what's going on here. Matthew did us a favor in a sense, because so many Jews might have joined the Christian beliefs, because obviously every religion gives some benefit to its followers, but Matthew made it implausible for any knowledgeable Jew to get involved in it. And the more knowledgeable Jew that you are, the less likely it is that you would ever get involved in Christianity. Conversely, I should say one other thing. As it turns out, this is going to be very crazy, but as it turns out, the vast majority of people who are not Jewish who convert to Judaism are Christians. And not only are they Christians, they usually, generally speaking, they're coming from the evangelical world. Generally speaking, it's the most knowledgeable Christians that are the ones who are converting to Judaism. We are living in this time where evangelicals are in this whole thing of focusing on the Jews, but that triggered a curiosity among non-Jews about Judaism. They study it, and many of them are converting. They're waiting online to get into conversion programs here in Israel. So the crazy thing is that the Jews who do become Christians are those who know nothing about the faith they've abandoned, and the Christians who converting to Judaism, by and large, are coming from the group of Christians that are the most knowledgeable, and therefore they see right through what Matthew is doing. And therefore, Matthew has benefited the Jewish people in a way that most people wouldn't imagine. It's very counterintuitive, but that's exactly what's happening now, and you'll understand how that works.
Dr. Price, did you want to make a comment about that so far?
I could, but I think the rabbi was about to give examples.
Yeah,
I can wait for them. I'm interested to hear.
Well, you started off by mentioning Isaiah 53. So, as it turns out, Isaiah 53 is different than other polemical texts that Christians use, because most Christians were blown away by this. But as it turns out, Isaiah 9, 5 and 6, or 6 and 7, depending on Jewish Bible, a child shall be born to us, a son given to us, that's never quoted in the Christian Bible. That's a later development. And the writers of the New Testament knew about Isaiah 9 and Isaiah 8 because they quoted it. Matthew famously quotes it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He conflates it. Don't ask what he does to it. I don't want to even go into it. It's too much for this right now. But it never occurred to them that Isaiah 9, 5, and 6 could ever be applied to a divine Messiah until the 2nd century. That's what's very strange. Something we mentioned in the past, that the New Testament somehow didn't think it was important enough to mention that Psalm 22 says, "And they pierced my hands and my feet." Again, a later development. In contrast, Isaiah 53 it appears somewhat prominently. It's not as prominent as other texts, but it appears quite a few times in the New Testament. Philip converting the eunuch from Gaza, it comes up there, and what happens in Isaiah 53 is really what happens to Christians. This is my heart goes out to them. And that is almost no Christian is reading the book of Isaiah. What's happening is instead they're given fulfillment citation communication cards where they're supposed to memorize certain verses, prophecy fulfillment. And unless it's, there are some very, very studious Christians, but very few who are ever reading the whole book of Isaiah carefully. They simply have memorized a few passages, Isaiah 7, Isaiah 9, Isaiah 53, that's the end of it. And in fact, if you ask the Christian, what does it say in Isaiah 52 or 54, they would have no idea unless they looked it up. No idea. Yeah. This is what's like a helicopter study. Helicopters are able to just land in a certain place. And that's what Christians are doing. They're just landing in Isaiah 53. And no matter what you think about the book of Isaiah, no matter what you think, whoever wrote this prophet, whoever wrote this book, clearly anticipated that if you're reading 53, you've already read 52 and 49 and 48. That means no matter what your beliefs are, it is axiomatic that the prophet thought that if you got to 53, that means you've read the chapters that introduce it, which no Christian does. So as it turns out, Isaiah 53 doesn't have the word Messiah in it. It is about a suffering servant mentioned twice at the end of 52 and in 53. And the question is, who is this? If you out of context, you have no clue. But if you read the chapters that introduce it, you know exactly what's going on. That's how Jews read the text. No one reads 53 without, we read Isaiah 41, verse 8 and 9. You, Israel.
This reminds me, I just want to say that this reminds me of when people run to passages like Genesis 1. We shall make them in our own image. Trinitarians will run there and find this our own image, these ideas that are plural. Oh, there's the Trinity. So that the helicopter landing, don't worry about chapter 2, verse, just let me just focus on this one spot. And that's
text.
Yeah, I mean, I read the Bible, don't get me wrong, as a Christian. I'm just speaking from the Christian's point of view. But if you were to ask me off the top of my head, what does Isaiah 52 mean, or what does it say, or 54, I wouldn't know. I'm not even going to lie. You memorize what is important from what you think is true from the Christian worldview. In fact, they have a saying in Christianity, and not only in Christianity, the translators of the King James Bible put in, I was reading something on it from the people who helped translate it. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he talked about the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, right? This is like a Christian saying. And that the idea is that, pretty much you have to interpret everything through the New Testament paradigm. Their entire interpretive framework comes through the New Testament. So they're not able to see the importance of that area's context, that time, that locale, no matter what you believe. I know that you're an atheist, okay? And I know that Rabbi is a practicing Jew who's Orthodox. Regardless, you guys recognize there's context in Isaiah that is meant for a certain audience that is not the Matthean Gospels context. They might be ripping it up and using it and manipulating it and whatnot, as Rabbi's saying, or as others might say, just reusing it and don't have the molestation, intentions, as some scholars want to put. But regardless, that has its own purpose and context. And so I would love to hear the interpretation from a Jewish point of view, actually, on what is going on in Isaiah 53, because the suffering servant, goodness gracious, that gets used by the Christians to, like, Jesus suffered. Come on, you know what I mean? And most don't realize there's a context that happens in the time in which this author is trying to intend this is being written. So
I'll just rattle this off quickly, not just go. But Isaiah 41, 8 and 9, these are very famous texts. Isaiah 43, verse 10 and 11. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, my servant, which means whoever the servant is, its witnesses. In Hebrew, atem edai no mashem avdi asher bacharti. Isaiah 44, verse 1, 44, 21, 45, 4, 48, 20, 49, 3. It's all of, that's the point. That means if you read those texts, it identifies the servant as not of all the Jewish people, but the faithful remnant of the Jewish people who God will protect from all harm, and these will people who will be devoted to God. What is actually happening in Isaiah 53? It's a soliloquy, meaning the nations of the world are speaking in complete astonishment in the Messianic age. So shall he cast down many nations. Isaiah 52, verse 15. The chat break is artificial. So shall he cast out my nations. Kings will shut their mouth in astonishment because of him. For that which they had never heard, they will see, which they had never considered, they'll finally witness. And they'll ask the question, who would have believed the report? Unless you know who is speaking in Isaiah 83, you really can go home. And this is not just true in Isaiah 83. If you're studying a biblical text and you have no clue who is talking, go home. You can never understand the text. So you don't know who's talking and who is he talking about. And I've done this with audiences where I ask audiences who's speaking, and sometimes the majority of my audience are Christians, and they are clueless because it's not taught to them. They're not evil. So number one, those who are speaking all the way through verse 8 are the nations of the world, and they're surprised. What are they surprised by? They're shocked because everything they had thought until this point has been disproved, has been disconfirmed, because the righteous servant is raised up above all. And they then have to make sense out of then why the Jew hatred? Why did the Jews suffer so much? Why did the servant suffer so much? You have to remember that Christians consider, as an example, that why did the Jews suffer so much? If you ask a Christian who's being honest with you, why is it that the Jews suffer so much? They'll say, well, they suffer a lot because they reject Christ. If you think what I just said is the ranting of some Klansman, you're making a mistake. This is every... If you, the viewer, think that what I'm saying is some like, oh, well, there's a lot of anti-Semite, you know what? That means you've never studied the church fathers. You've never studied they all said this with one voice, with the same voice. In fact, you could try this out. I didn't ask Dr. Price this, but many, many years ago, I had to buy the writings of the church fathers in volumes. And I still have it now you don't need it anymore because you go online. But in the old days, I had to study the church fathers. There was no online, and I had to have it in my personal library. Or if you go online and just find all the writing of the church fathers free, the trademark is over, copyright's over. So you just
they made enough money. Is that what you're saying? Okay,
it's done. It's more than you just look for the word Jew, like just all the writing of church fathers. You know, Anthony-Nicene, Nicene. Just look at the word Jew. Just search the word Jew or Jews, okay, and just see what comes up. You know, that's the kind of stuff in Canada, not in America, will get you thrown in jail. America doesn't have, these kind of racist laws against hate speech. But Canada and Austria, you go to prison for this kind of stuff. All the church, right now, just take my word for it. The church fathers all saw the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the Second Commonwealth, as a sign that this is what happens to the people who have rejected Christ and, worse, committed the unspeakable crime of deicide. So if that is the case, if the nations of the world attribute the striking suffering of the Jew to his unwillingness to accept the gods and of their people, what do you do then in the Messianic age when the nations realize that all this time the Jews were correct? How do you then ascribe Jewish suffering? And that's what happens and explodes in Isaiah 53. This is the Messianic age. The nations of the world are speaking, as we're told in the text, and they're shocked. And they ask the question, Mi hem lishmo sein uzrei Hashem al mi negusa. It's Isaiah 53:1. Who would believe this and look to whom the arm of the Lord has been revealed? Yeah. So they have to now figure this out. And what the conclusion they come to is the following. Two things. Number one, the Jewish people suffered as a result of our iniquities, meaning they persecuted us, put us on trains, and threw us in a gas chamber. And our suffering is the result of their bad behavior. And second is very, very deep. The second part is that, let me say this to you in a way that's an interesting view. If you meet people who are not Jewish, who come to embrace or feel a certain affection for the Jewish people, very often if you scratch and ask, what is it about Judaism and the Jews that made you start to rethink your attitude towards Jews, very often people say, I think about Jewish suffering and how they've suffered without mercy throughout history. And it engenders within the non-Jewish world a certain compassion for our people. And in fact, Christians speak differently today than they did 100 years ago. This is a part of the Jewish theology, of Isaiah's theology, and that is, by his stripes we were healed. When you suffered, it began to change our view about God. By his stripes we healed is a very touching thing, because it really touches at the heart of many people who have joined our people, that if you You ask them, why is it that you are now considering Judaism? They say, you know what? The Jewish people are unique, and they've suffered so much. So that's the soliloquy of 53. That's 1 through 8. And verse 9 through 12, God resumes speaking, and there he explains that by his knowledge, my servant will vindicate the just for many, which is completely anti-Christian. What do you mean, by his knowledge, my servant vindicates the just of the nations? It should say by his blood. Of course, none of this has anything to do with Christianity. And also, one of the caveat here is the church is going to molest this text. That means in Isaiah 53, the servant is referred to both in the plural and in the singular. Just like this is the fourth of 4 servant songs. Just as previously in Isaiah 43, 10 is an example. You are my witnesses. That's where the witnesses get their name from. And my servant, plural singular, in poetic literature, 90% of Isaiah is poetic. So therefore, when it says at the end of 53:8, it says these last words, the last 4 words of the passage is, Mi pesha ami negalamo. Because of the transgressions of my people, they were stricken. Mi pesha ami, this is 53:8, the last words. The nations are speaking. Because of the transgressions of my people, negalamo, they were stricken. Well, how do you think that's going to sit with the church? The answer is this is a nightmare, because the servant can't be many people. It can only be one, and that's Jesus. So the church changes it. And therefore, if you go to a New International Version, the King James does this differently, like there too, in some crazy Jacobian idiom that no one uses anymore. So it sort of blocks it that way. But these Christian translators, the New American Standard, all of them, they all go, he was stricken. He, lamo doesn't mean he, it means them. It's a third person plural pronoun. So I can go through this. I don't want to overwhelm our viewers. So this had to be done. Wherever Isaiah refers to the servant in the plural, the church in its translations have to render it in the singular, and Christians are helpless here. My heart goes out to you, Christians, watching this, because you have no way of accessing the original, and then the Christians have you in the translation.
Mm. Well, I want to defend Matthew as on the issue of whether he is just proof texting out of context to pull the wool over people's eyes in a manipulative way, as of course people have, like Joseph A. Wellis, who wrote this book, Is It God's Word? He said, this is just shameless nonsense. Even Morton Smith, much more recent author, says the same thing pretty much. I can't help thinking of what Christer Stendahl and others have said about the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially the Habakkuk Pesher, where it seems like they had this idea that, yeah, we know what it originally meant. And these, of course, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're usually thought to be sectarian Jews, not Christians. But their idea was, we know what it said, but that's over. Does that mean it's a museum relic? No, it can't be. God must have further messages for us. It's a living scripture. And so they said that their founder, the teacher of righteousness, showed them this, that there were messages in there, that since this is an inspired text, that the Spirit of God had embedded these messages, predictions that are not apparent on the surface, but that could be recognized in retrospect by the people that had the right lens to read them. And you see this, it's really predicting the teacher of righteousness, and this is predicting the wicked priest who had him ambushed, and so on and so on. Well, they didn't mean that anybody reading the text should automatically see this. This wasn't the original point. And it was a product of what some call charismatic exegesis. And Stendahl said it looks like Matthew's doing the same thing. He can't have been stupid enough to think that Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I've called my son, was actually about Jesus and the Holy Family going to Egypt and coming back. He must have zeroed in on my son. I bet that's a hidden prediction of Jesus. So he and his family must have gone to Egypt and came back. Or Isaiah 7:14. The maiden or whatever shall conceive and bring forth a son and all that. He must have known, especially compared with chapter 8, where there's the same thing all over again. And it's Isaiah's talking about his own children. He must have known that. But he's saying that there's this hidden significance that we now see. So if that is the case, and I think that works with most of those citations, he's not trying to prove it to outsiders, as I always read, but rather he's saying we Christians know this. Pretty impressive, huh? But that's not quite the same thing as in Luke, for instance, in Luke 24, where Luke seems to assume that any idiot reading the law, the prophets, and the Psalms should have seen that Jesus was predicted here. And of course, he gives no specifics, so it's easy to say. But Matthew seems to me to be doing what the Dead Sea Scrolls writers did, this Pesher interpretation, that on the surface, yeah, of course, we know what it meant, but the scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven in Matthew 13, he's like a householder who brings forth from his treasury goods old and new. He knows what it used to mean and what it now means. And so I think that's very likely what's happening, that he isn't just trying to pull a fast one. I mean, that's believable. That's plausible, because who could check him out? Like you say, what access did anybody have? You know, you couldn't go into the local hostelry and find a Gideon Bible in the drawer. You wouldn't have your own copy to check. So I can see that. That's plausible. But it seems to me that what Matthew is doing is following the rules of some sectarian Jews of his day. And to their credit, two evangelical scholars that I know of, probably more, Gordon Fee, who was a teacher of mine at Gordon Conwell Seminary, and Richard Longenecker, they both said, that seems to be what they're doing. Now, that doesn't mean we can do it. That's an ancient system. It was part of their culture. But in terms of what we think is going on interpreting the Bible, that's not legitimate anymore. We can't pretend we're just directly inspired by the Spirit. And it's uncontrollable. Like, this is Luther's point with rejecting allegorizing. He said, if you can do this, the Bible can mean anything and everything, and if that is so, it means nothing in particular. So I kind of think when fundamentalists, ignorant of this background stuff, say, oh yeah, Isaiah was talking about the birth of Jesus and the suffering of Jesus, what they're doing is exactly like when Pentecostals say, when I speak in tongues, I'm actually speaking Ugaritic or Lithuanian, and I never studied it. Look, no, we know you're not, because it's been recorded many times. Linguists have listened to it. Even if it was an unknown language, you'd be able to detect a syntactical structure, and it's never there. But does that mean they're just charlatans or idiots? No, they don't understand that it's an old, venerable, ancient practice to indulge in glossolalia. It's like words cannot contain the praise I want to give to God, so Shambalagasi, the language of angels, as 1 Corinthians 13 says. You don't have to go with this stupid, mistaken understanding of what you're doing. It's quite legitimate. You're making it seem ridiculous. And I think in the same way, it's a failure to see that Matthew's doing what the Dead Sea Scrolls guys were doing, that makes him look like a charlatan when perhaps he wasn't, at least not in that respect. But that's the way I look at it.
Would that be a spot where you guys probably disagree on this?
No, look, nobody's engaging in mind reading, right?
Right.
I mean, no one's capable of mind reading, and there's no doubt that every everyone present, we're tapping into our own mind and soul and go, I would never do something so grotesque. Certainly and that's how we assess people just in general. And then we're really surprised when we encounter bad faith actors. And in a courtroom, when criminals are charged and have sentenced, then their past behavior or other behavior comes up in the sentencing. What should the sentencing be? So if Matthew was pearly white and didn't engage in this grotesque anti-Jewish rhetoric and making up stories about the Jews saying his blood be upon us and our children, and a ridiculous story about Pontius Pilate's wife, and that Pontius Pilate was some flimsy personality who could be persuaded by those Jews. So maybe then I would go, but we're dealing with a bad faith actor because we could see everything else, whoever wrote this text, whoever else wrote the M source, that it's hard to be charitable to such a person. But I think but this is all in mind reading, but what I want to do is something that I'm sure Dr. Price knows very, very well, because this is the clear point. This is the point. This is the chicanery of the evangelical fundamentalists. See, they're playing a bait and switch. They're playing a shell game. When you meet a missionary, what they tell you, you're going to know this, they will tell you that I can prove to you from the Jewish scriptures that Jesus is the promised Jewish Messiah. That's what they're going to say. I am not setting up a straw man and toppling it. The difference between me and the evangelicals is I use a steelman approach. I always present the evangelical position from the strongest, most vigorous way. They are claiming that if you read the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, Jesus is bouncing off every page. He's clearly prophesied there, and it's impossible. Not only that, then they start the mathematics. If you do every prophecy, he did 300, that's 8 to the 10 trillionth times to the 40th power, and like this. And I was watching a guy on YouTube, and I was going, oh, this man needs help. So it's so ridiculous. He came down. How many people were born in Bethlehem and rode a donkey? Nobody. This is the most impossible thing in the world. The other thing also, to do this, you see the behavior of whoever wrote Matthew, and as an example, you see the way he manipulated the text of the grand entry into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where he takes Zechariah 9:9 and he misreads it. There's a parallelism in Isaiah with Zechariah where it's referring to one animal, but just the way the text is written, it could be misread as two animals if you're not familiar with just the way these prophets wrote. So Matthew literally just changed the story and has Jesus coming into Jerusalem on two animals, and it's very clear that you just compare to Luke, Mark, he just changed it. So whoever did this is a bad faith actor. He went to the text, he read it as two animals, and then rewrote the story to match his bad reading of the text. It's hard to be charitable to such a person, but we're all gauging in mind reading. But practically today, the fundamentals are saying that if you read your Bible, Jesus clearly prophesies in the Old Testament. And how could Isaiah, written 700 years earlier, how could Jeremiah, written 500 years earlier than Christ, how could they possibly have known? So they're not doing that. And then you say, well, let's take a look at these supposed fulfillments. Let's take a look at Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. Let's take a look at Micah chapter 5, a nightmare. Mm-hmm. And then they come, well, I didn't mean it like that, but there's a Pesha and there's a secondary, a Midrashic. I said, wait, that's not what you sold me on. Your sales pitch is that it's clear in the Jewish Bible, prophecies about Jesus. Then when I look it up, all I discover is just what I would discover in any criminal activity, and that's someone trying to wipe up all the fingerprints using bleach. That's what they do in the translations. That's not what you told me. Don't give me Pesha answers. Don't tell me they're using some Midrashic and so on. And what's even more astonishing is that who is making these arguments today? They're not Roman Catholic. These are the sola scriptura guys. That means they're Protestants today. So therefore, this argument doesn't even work, because according to the Protestants today, it's true the Catholic Church once behaved this way, but largely the Catholic Church is not engaged in Jewish evangelism. They're just trying to do damage control of the problems. They have other problems there. Yeah. But it's all the evangelicals. These are the people who say sola scriptura. But somehow, when it comes to Isaiah 53, no Isaiah 53, that Matthew is using a Midrashic application. What happened to sola scriptura? Flush down the toilet. So it's this game of the shell game. Does this work? Does that work? How do you do that? Your argument was that the text says it plainly. I look at the text, it isn't there. It just says the young woman. Then you're saying there's some Midrashic understanding. First of all, it's completely unfalsifiable, but that was not the selling pitch you gave me on day one. It's very obvious to me.
I've never heard anybody, a fundamentalist like that, who knew about Midrash and Pesher and all that stuff. This, not that I would know what everybody wrote, but these guys that I have read or heard, they're not the kind of they're not doing apologetics. In fact, they're trying to wean evangelicals from doing this kind of thing by saying, look, that's not what Matthew meant. Don't think he was using these crappy arguments, because he's just doing what the Dead Sea Scrolls people did, to say that it was a clear prediction and then fall back to that. Oh my gosh, that's outrageous. I just have never heard anybody do that.
You got to imagine, though, if it was that clear, just common sense here, and this is in the vein, but not in the vein of what you guys are saying, this wouldn't be so difficult for the Jews who read and knew the scriptures in the first century to see. It's almost in that same anti-Semitic type of framework, so to speak, of saying, in a way, I'm not trying to pull that topic up necessarily in this, but I do want to mention it. It's almost like, you idiots, you couldn't see it in your own scripture. I mean,
that drives me nuts.
If the Christian is right, the Christian apologist is right, running around telling everybody, it's right there. How can you not see it?
No, you're right. That does have to do with the anti-Semitism, and saying, yeah, well, these people were just too stupid to say what.
Yeah,
it's like when, even if you're not a Jew and you've got Christians making their arguments, say, I don't find that convincing. Oh, I'll tell you why. It's because you've got some sin you won't repent on. What? The ad hominem, they'll say anything, and that is bad faith and just not becoming for people that say they're interested in the truth.
Yeah, but they're copying. They have good teachers. They have people like Paul who speak about the Jews in that way. They got 2 Corinthians, where Paul is openly saying the scales and veils and schmales and veils and over their eyes. Like, they're not. They have been polluted by the founders of Christianity, and they're just imitating them and behaving the way Paul did. Paul is not the guy I'd want to be having dinner with. I mean, Paul couldn't even get along with fellow Christians. He get along with me. This is not happening. I'll tell you the craziest story, just that to highlight what Dr. Price just said. The craziest story in the world. So I was the rabbi of Indonesia before I moved to Jerusalem. So, and I moved here a year and a half ago. I was walking up, actually I was on a parade, on a float, going up Fifth Avenue in New York City. And it was in Israel, they prayed, and I was moving to Israel the very next day. I was flying to Israel. And I'm on this float going up Fifth Avenue, because even though Fifth Avenue goes south, the parades go north. And as we're coming to the end of the parade, I see a guy, and I have this on video on my channel. There's a guy holding up a huge sign. If I tell you, I don't even know how he held this up, a gigantic sign. Isaiah 53, why are you Jews hiding Isaiah 53? And then he goes, Google it. I'm not kidding. Now, there must have been 500,000 people at the parade, and I had a feeling I was the only one who knew what he was referring to. He was saying in that placard that the Jews are hiding Isaiah 53. I went, wow. So the float, so he was like on 74th Street, 73rd Street, and the parade came to an end, let's say, on 76th Street. And there's small blocks in Manhattan. So I jumped off the float, got on the street, took my cell phone, put it on video, and I ran over to him just because it wasn't a far walk to go back to this guy who's holding up this. It's just amazing that people would like attack the Jews at a parade that there are 500,000 Jews. Like I don't know what's with them. So I went over to him. I said, "Oh, very nice sign you have there." And I asked him, so the Jews are hiding Isaiah 53. Yeah. So I asked him, do me a favor, tell me what it says in Isaiah 52. He started cursing me. He says, I have to look it up. I said, look it up. But 53, you do know what it says. Yeah. What is 74? I don't know. I have to look it up. And then he just goes into a credit. It turns out he says he's working for Jews for Jesus.
Oh.
So I said, this is exactly what's happening. The Jews aren't hiding Isaiah 53. It's the Christians that are hiding Isaiah 52 and 54. They're hiding. It's everything is the opposite. It's just reversed. We don't hide anything. When we study Isaiah, we start with Isaiah chapter 1 and we end with 66. We don't do helicopter landings in the middle of a book. You're the one who's hiding the rest of the Bible and burying even Isaiah 83 by not revealing the Hebrew language to your Christian children who are going to school. You're hiding it, not the Jews. So this just brings out the point that Dr. Price just made.
Can I ask, just in your interpretation here of Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, this is Israel, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me. This is the people of God. Okay, this is not an individual man like Jesus, even though it's been interpreted that way through Pesher and all that kind of stuff by different people, various different people. I just want to point that out because that is the point, and you bring it up so well. You guys articulated that great. I used to think the same thing. Once you know the story, or the stories of the New Testament, really Christians are taught it's like a single story, even though it's, different books and stuff. Once you have that, then you go headhunting. You go headhunting into the Old Testament looking for your landing pads to land your aircraft. And I used to do this, and I'd go find stuff. And, man, you can do it all throughout the Psalms. I mean, you can find things, and I bet you there's stuff that we could probably go look and find that church fathers probably never hit to create a connection in our minds that, this fits to Jesus or this fits to Paul or somehow. I got a guy too, Rabbi. I don't know. This is off topic a little, but I want to ask your thoughts. There is a Jewish scholar, if I'm not mistaken, I think he's a Jewish scholar, who said that Paul was prophesied, Shaul was prophesied to be someone who would come, he's a trickster, that this is in the Hebrew scriptures and that he's never been disproven about this, but that Paul was prophesied long before he would come as Saul or Shaul, Shaul, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember the name of the guy. I'll probably have to get back with you if you haven't heard this. I just wanted to know, have you ever heard of that he was going to come and like trick people and stuff?
No, I've never heard that.
I'll have to send it to you.
I think I have, but I can't think of where I've heard it.
I'll have to forward you the email. Maybe that'll be a topic.
Now there is the famous Deuteronomy chapter 7. But I wouldn't never say as a religious Jew that's specifically referring to Paul. You have Deuteronomy 13 begins by telling us about a prophet or dreamer of dreams that shows you miracles, signs, and wonders. And he says, follow other gods you didn't know. Do not follow that prophet or dreamer of dreams. I'm only testing you. And then it tells you about your brother, the son of your mother. I mean, it's one of the illusions that only a mother transmits Jewish identity, who tries to seduce you. So you have, that would be the context where logically, but I don't, I've never heard that before.
Yeah, I think that there's a reference to Paul in even in the Apocalypse of John in chapter 2, when it's talking about those who teach you to not follow the law, but also to act with sexual immorality, all that kind of stuff.
Could be Balaam, so-called.
Yep. So I think it's funny how even messianic versions of Christianity that were Jewish didn't like Paul. So you got to imagine, like, Orthodox Pharisaic Jews weren't fond of the messianic, kinds that were there, but even they can't get along with Paul. Like, Paul's just, Paul's doing his own thing. Anyway, Isaiah 53 is the big one, obviously. So let's talk about a couple other ones. You brought up Isaiah 14. Is it 7:14? Sorry, 7:14. That's where the number came up. That was my secret Pesheristic thinking. No, I'm just kidding. But no, what's going on here? Like, can you take us through what the apologists are saying and what does it mean, obviously, in its context, you know?
Oh, this is like a no-brainer. So first we'll talk about Matthew 1:23, Matthew's infancy story, and we have two of them. But as we would expect, Matthew is always, this is to fulfill. That Matthew is insisting that Jesus' miraculous conception is not just an accident or something striking, but it's a fulfillment of what it says in Isaiah, that it says in the prophets, that behold, and this is the way it reads in Matthew, behold, a virgin shall conceive, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. That's totally just blew up the text. Because when we go back to Isaiah 7:14, everything is different. The important word is virgin, isn't there? There's only one way to say virgin in Hebrew, in both biblical and modern Hebrew, that's betulah. And in case someone thinks, well, Isaiah was Victorian and he didn't want to use such words like virgin, big mistake. Virginity was very important to the prophets, the Jewish people. And the word betulah, I don't remember the number, but it's going to be close. The word virgin appears in Tanakh a little less than 150 times. I don't remember the number, but whatever it is, it's way, way up there. The text says in Alma, behold, the young woman is with a child. She's already pregnant. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. Mm-hmm. And what is the Matthew's, you can see, changes the article from a definite article to an indefinite article. Matthew says she will call his name Emmanuel. Matthew says they will call his name Emmanuel. That's how Matthew 1:23 says. But the Hebrew in Isaiah says, V'karashim Emmanuel, she, meaning the mother, will call him Emmanuel. Matthew has to change that as well, because Mary never calls Jesus Emmanuel. In fact, she's instructed in the Annunciation to call him Jesus and not Emmanuel never comes. So he changes that. I mean, there's just so much altered. But what is happening in Isaiah 7 is that there's a civil war. At the time, the northern kingdom of Israel was separated from Judah, from the southern kingdom, a split that occurred after the death of King Solomon. And the northern kingdom had allied itself with Syria, with Damascus, because they did not want the southern kingdom to ally itself with the Assyrian Empire. Very big distinction. So what happens is that Judea, the southern kingdom, is surrounded by two enemies who are looking to destroy the Davidic dynasty, which was the king at the time was Achaz, who's really a very wicked guy, perhaps the worst Davidic king in history, because he never even repents like Manasseh. And Isaiah comes to him with his wife and with another child, Shar-Yashuv, to tell him when these two kingdoms will be destroyed. They will not succeed. And he says that, behold, the young woman, pointing, that's like a point. It's a definite article. That was extracted, that was removed, that was excoriated, that was just blown out by Matthew. The young woman is with the child. She's already pregnant. It's not a future prophecy. And she will have a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. Now, what's happening is, and then it continues, butter and honey will the child eat when it knows to reject bad and choose good, because before the child knows to reject evil and choose good, these two enemies, meaning the northern kingdom and Syria, will be destroyed, will be vanquished. And as Dr. Price said, this is repeated over in Isaiah 8, except in Isaiah 8, the instruction now is for Isaiah, who's married to the prophetess, what he has to call the child's name. And again, before the child knows to say mommy and daddy, see the first 5 verses of Isaiah 8, these enemies are going to be destroyed. So that's the real context. The real context is an event that took place roughly 2,700 years ago. The Assyrian Empire is roughly 7 centuries older than Christianity. It's a contemporaneous event. Now, theologically, I'm not going to get into why would Isaiah bring this up in the Bible. It's very interesting. But the key is that the context would make no sense. I mean, imagine Isaiah trying to comfort Ahaz, the Davidic king, who's under siege, and say, hey, buddy, you got nothing to worry about. I know things look pretty grim right now with 2 kingdoms surrounding Jerusalem. Sit back, relax, throw up your feet, and throw off your shoes because I got to talk to you. You have nothing to worry about. Yeah, it looks terrible right now. You got Damascus and the Northern Kingdom. They're ready to destroy you. But listen up, buddy. Pull out a Cuban. I got some news for you. Let's get out a Cuban and a pina colada. We got some talking to do here. It's all going to be just fine. Really? How's that? How do you figure? It looks pretty grim right now. It's all going to be good. Why is that? Because in 700 years from now, in 700 years, don't worry, 700 years, that's it. What is that? 700 years ago, there's a lady, she's going to be a virgin, and then she's going to have a baby boy. And before that baby boy knows the difference between good and evil, these two kings who are right now want to kill you, they're going to be vanquished. So the guy will ask Isaiah, are you on heroin or are you on crack? Like, which drug are you on? Are you taking propofol intravenously? Are you like, what kind of marijuana are you smoking? So this is so insane. The context is so insane because how could Jesus' birth be of any comfort to a man living 700 years earlier surrounded by two kings? And who then are these two kings that Isaiah refers to in time of Jesus? And when exactly did Jesus mature could say mommy and daddy? I thought he didn't have a daddy. This is so ridiculous. But as I said, as Dr. Price said, Christians don't know that. They just land in Isaiah 7:4. They have no clue what the context is. How does this coming up?
Run! Go! Get to the chopper!
Who's speaking? Who's not speaking? And therefore, people just wind up in the church like that.
I'll bet you a fundamentalist apologist could say, well, we know Isaiah miraculously extended the lifespan of Hezekiah, so maybe he made sure that this king would live for another 700 or 800 years.
Yeah. I think it's funny, though. I really, really do, because what you pointed out just now, Rabbi, and I'm sure you would agree here, Price, is that they're not just landing in Isaiah 7. They're landing on a very small piece in Isaiah 7. They're not borrowing the two kings from the north. They're not using, they're literally being this small, tiny little, all right, there's a young woman, it might mean virgin, it might mean young woman, let's take it. It's like, what? So I think anybody can perform this. Anyone can create a New Testament or a newer New Testament. I'd love to see you do it. And anyone can do this, by the way. So if you just have a good enough imagination and if you can borrow from certain other stories and text, use some of the contemporaneous stuff that's going on in current day affairs, you can start your own movement. And the New Testament is the blueprint. So anyway, I'm just saying.
What do you think of the Bible code? You remember that from the 90s? People said, well, if you take every 18 and a half letter and run them together, you're going to get a prediction of so-and-so. That's kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, so, that was done. I have an article on my website debunking that. And I at the time I wrote the article, I had the Reverend Sung Young Moon coming up all over the book of Jeremiah. I mean, you can, the Jewish Bible is just enormous. I don't think people realize the scope of, we're dealing with nearly 24,000 passages. I mean, in comparison to Christian Bibles, I think something about 7,000. I mean, it's just huge. And you come up with anything. And in fact, there are Christians that did that. Do you know that following that, there was a book called Theomatics?
Yeah, by some basketball player.
Yeah. Right. So there was a book. See, this is why I enjoy it, because I could talk to Dr. Price. So there's a book where they try to use the Greek to do this, but they said you could be off by one number and then you could do anything. The Jewish Bible is just so large that if you want, you could throw in anything and come up with anything. You could, because it's so enormous. You could take, and people have done this with the New York Times, and you just take a New York Times and you could pop up with anything. If you allow the sequencing to have as much distance as you want between one letter and another character, well, then you can spell out anything you want to. And it's always after the fact they say, oh, the code is in the text. Well, why couldn't you tell us about 9/11 before? That would have been really helpful. Like, because they came out after 9/11 and say, oh, it's all there, the Twin Towers and all there. And I go, really? But why are you coming out with this after it? I mean, if you came out with this before 9/11, it might have been a little helpful for us to check the passengers getting on the flight in Newark and in Boston. So, I don't, I'm very suspicious of this stuff.
So I have to ask one more really good one, because we can go on and on and on and on and on and on and on passages that are kind of hijacked, but I want to get like common ones. I figure would be good to get one more really good one. What is a really good one other than Isaiah 53 and Isaiah 7:14 that you hear Christians always come at you with, Rabbi? And I'd like to get you to comment on it, have you, Dr. Price, comment on it, and we can wrap up the show on this.
It's like, I say this, I feel like a mosquito in a nudist colony. I don't know where to start.
Psalm 22.
No, we already touched on that. True. So we gotta avoid the one.
I mean, look, very, very famously. I mean, we can probably do so many shows on this, but very famously, Micah 5.
Let's go there
too. Because that's a big one. That we talked about that we alluded to that in the previous show. The context is, for some mysterious reason, the Magi and their magic star that has a GPS system has to stop off at Herod's palace. And just for those who didn't watch that broadcast, the reason why that's preposterous is that the star they're following, somehow once they're told by the Jews Bethlehem, the star goes, oh, I know exactly where the house is, and stops right over the house. So the star knows, you don't need it. And the Herod part is really, in my view, it was inserted in order to ratchet up the behavior of Jews in comparison to non-Jews. The Jews want to kill the baby and will wipe out an entire city of children, whereas the non-Jews are worshiping the little child savior. But so what they're told, what the Magi are told in Matthew chapter 2 is that they're told that the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem. And if you go to Matthew 2, verse 6, it quotes the text. And I use that word quote in quotation marks very loosely. This is really nasty stuff. And in fact, I think even the more sophisticated viewers are going to find this very shocking. This is something that people don't notice, and it's a mind blower. So the text in Micah was a prophet who lived in the Assyrian Empire 2,700 years ago. He was a contemporary of Isaiah, Hosea, and Amos. So he's talking about the birthplace of King David. First, I'll explain it. And he's talking about that the Messiah is a descendant of King David, which is very important. The name David appears in the Jewish Bible more frequently than any other name, Moses included, well over 1,000 times. Yeah, so wow is right. So Micah is telling us that the connection that the Messiah is going to have to King David is that in fact King David is born in Bethlehem, and the Messiah is the descendant of the one born in Bethlehem. Now, of course, we know that Bethlehem is the birthplace of King David. 1 Samuel 17:58. It's all over the place. So in Matthew 2, verse 6, the text would read something, but you, Bethlehem in Judea, you're by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler. Now, what it says in Hebrew at the end is 4 Hebrew words, because this is really a quote from Micah 5:2. One caveat, one in the Hebrew Bible, it's Micah 5:1. The text reads U'mitzaysav mikeda mimei olam. This is very important. The original text says U'mitzaysav, which means and his going forth. That means, how is the relationship between the Messiah and Bethlehem? So U'mitzaysav, which means it's going forth. It comes out of Mikeda. Mikeda means from early days, from ancient times, meolam from the earliest times, meaning going back to King David. Now, that can't sit in Matthew. There's no way that his origins are from old and from ancient times can ever be in Matthew 2:6. Why? Because that ending tells us that the connection between the Messiah and Bethlehem is not that the Messiah is born in Bethlehem, but it's from a much earlier time than the Messiah, namely King David. So what does our good friend, the author of Matthew, I love Matthew. What would I ever do without him? So what does he do? He takes out his mouse, he selects in the words from his going forth is from early days, from ancient times. So you have white letters on a blue background. He deletes it and he writes instead, what? And he will be a shepherd of my people Israel. He'll be, that's what it says in Matthew 2:6. Please, I tell you, if you look it up yourself, you won't believe me. And you can use your same King James. Go look at Matthew 2:6 and compare it to Micah 5:2, and you can see that I didn't sneak into your house and stick this in there. He literally surgically removed the words from, and his going forth is from ancient times, from early days. And he instead put in, he'll be a shepherd of Israel. Where did you get a shepherd of Israel? How'd you stick it in there? Because he had to remove the offending part of the passage, interpolate something that isn't there in order to create a Matthew machination text that doesn't exist. That's from Planet Matthew. That's what we're talking about here. And this is like, could you believe it? I think that most of the viewers are going to be going with the Bible and going, oh my God, I can't believe this. And the Septuagint won't rescue the church on this one. That means, or the King James won't rescue you on this, because it says that in Micah, except they changed me, make head them to days of eternity to try to say the Messiah is forever. It's a complete mistranslation of Mimei Olam, but that's a different issue. But how do you take out words and put in words? That's a complete scam.
Dr. Price.
What do you think of the Oxford Jewish Annotated Bible?
The Oxford Jewish Annotated Bible?
The Jewish Study Bible, it's called. It's got all manner of footnotes and references to textual variants and so on. I never heard of a Jewish Study Bible. Yeah, I think that maybe it's the Oxford Jewish Study Bible.
I've never played that. I should say that Hebrew is, when I study in Hebrew, so that maybe something that I have not heard of, but I've never heard of that. One word of caution, I should say this, that later more liberal Christians do correct this and do in their annotation. There are Christian, I don't want everyone to think that every Christian Bible and translator engages in this chicanery. If you go to the New English Bible, the NEB, with the Oxford annotation, I think Metzger was the editor on that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
RSV for Metzger.
The RSV for Metzger.
C.H. God with the NEB.
So they both will point this out in their annotation. Metzger, the New Revised Standard Version, does translate Matthew, Isaiah 7:14 as "Behold the young woman." The young woman. They do correct that, but I'm not familiar with the Jewish Annotated Bible.
Yeah, I'll have to send you the link or something. I think that's the title, but I could be wrong. Going senile and.
Yeah. I just think it's interesting that where Rabbi's coming from versus what we are looking at when we look at it critically. We're kind of both looking at it critically. That's why we have a lot of common ground here. We're looking at it critically. To see them, hopscotching with verses and ideas and context and creating narratives and such. That's what we're seeing. That's what he's seeing. It's obvious. The interesting perception that Rabbi brings to the table is what I find so valuable about this, because I never thought ill intentions in that manner of anti-Semitism and things like that. You know what I mean? Or even a slap in the face. Let's say someone wants to come and go, I don't agree with Rabbi on the anti-Semitism all the way through. Either way, you could see how it would create such a thing, because if it was one Jewish group talking about, the leadership at the time or whatever, I've heard that argument where people try to divorce Well, not all Jews. It's not talking about all Jews. It's talking about these specific ones. Either way, look at what it's done. Look at the whole thing. It doesn't give any positive. And I try to tell this to our good full preterist buddies and the IO guys and all that. They talk about the New Testament is fulfilling all things that were prophesied to come to happen. And this is full preterism. It all happened. Tell me, in what manner did Israel really get redeemed? In what manner did 70 AD bring about what you say it is, salvation to Israel? If anything, it literally is doing the opposite. So how are you saying that 70 AD is a fulfillment of the destruction of Israel and Jerusalem? How in the world does that work in your thinking?
I didn't know they said that. I thought they were just talking about Christian redemption and all of that. Though I don't know how that would fit that.
Yeah, they believe that judgment, of course, comes in 70, but with judgment.
I want to, if I may, I want to blow a question past Dr. Price for a moment.
Please.
And it's a question I've never asked anyone. So I want to go to something that sounds like an enormous change, but it really isn't. So I want to talk about Testimonium Flavianum, Antiquities 1833, which is a famous interpolation of a passage about Jesus being the Christ and more than a man and all that stuff. So this is an infamous text, and I don't have to even ask you. We all agree. We know exactly when it came from. It's 4th century and so on, and because nobody else quotes it earlier. But what I want to ask you about, this is a thought that's been on my mind, and I want to run this past you. So it's interesting that surveys done of scholars of what they thought of Testimonium Flavianum. That means that everybody agrees, except for the fundamental. Everyone agrees that Josephus did not write that, what we see today. And we know that Josephus wasn't a Christian, and Origen says so in his commentary on Matthew. So the argument only exists today between two possibilities. Either it's a complete interpolation, it never existed in Hebrew, and it just was put in around the time of the Council of Nicaea in that region, someone around Eusebius, or there was a skeletal version of that, and that it was sort of built up by the church. That's basically the views. And I know, without asking you, I know we both know that this is a complete interpolation. But where I'm going with this is a little delicate. The surveys that were done of New Testament scholars and historians, the surveys that go back 70 years ago on Testimonium Flavianum, would have it that the majority, maybe 2/3, I may be off on this, but I think I'm close, that the majority of scholars held that Testimonium Flavianum was a complete invention. Nothing of that existed. The whole thing is made up. There was no skeletal. There was nothing. Josephus wrote nothing. And then roughly like 1/3 of scholars thought that there was some residual artifact of that and then it was built up based on Luke and so on, and Emmaus and so on. Now, what's interesting is the survey in recent decades has the result has sort of switched, where today roughly 2/3 of scholars say that no, there was some skeletal version. That seems to be the orthodoxy in the academic world. And there's still 1/3 that think that no, there was nothing there at all. My feeling about that is, how did they switch? Like, what did they discover a new Josephus? So my thinking is that it was a desire to be ecumenical, that academics are trying to find a way. Can we find a way that there's no really horrible bad faith actors here, but there was? So that means, is it what we're seeing now in general about scholars trying to find, well, can we find a compromise to be ecumenical so we don't have to say this is a complete holdup, a complete rape? Do we see that reflected in the numbers on Testimonium Flavianum and how that switched around?
That's exactly what I think. And a lot of writing by theologically liberal New Testament scholars about Jesus and Judaism seems to me to be the same sort of slanted fabrication. like at sometime to extremes, like Bruce Chilton, who knows a whole lot about the Targums and about ancient Judaism. In his book, A Biography of Jesus, Rabbi Jesus, I think it's called, he just retells the thing as if he's having visions like Anne Catherine Emmerich did. He says that Jesus' big deal was seeing the Merkavah in a heavenly vision. Where'd this happen? And he mentions it again and again and again. Of course, he's saying, well, the heavens opened. That's not much to go on. And so he's one of the most obvious. James Charlesworth is nearly as bad. And I think that that's what's going on in all of this. And it's so funny that despite some really killer arguments, at least one of which you referred to, between the Testimonium, as I call it, Flavianum, and Luke 24, and a study on the grammar of that passage compared to the Pilate references before and afterward, shows that it's changed so that, like in all the other ones, Pilate is the subject of sentences and he drives the narrative. But in this, this shows Pilate only in subordinate clauses and passive voice statements. And he says this is not what you would expect from the same writer. And the one that shows that it looks like Eusebius wrote it, because it fits too well. It's tendentious in the context in which he's discussing what Jesus was like, that he wasn't a mere mortal and they did miracles, he attracted Gentiles and Jews, etc. And but what they do is to say, like older scholars would have said, look at all these things like accordingly, he was the Christ. And others, they say, well, yeah, all right, Josephus couldn't have written that. So let's razor blade out the thing that show this is a Christian interpolation and say what's left must have been the original. That could have been, but if so, it's a little odd that he speaks of the Christians as a tribe today who are named for him, and they've cut out the phrase, he was the Christ. Maybe you're going to call them the Jesuits, but not the Christians. And it just seems to me the whole thing is a hoax, and it is motivated by an admirable thing. I want to see more, not less, interfaith dialogue, but I just can't stand this cheating in the service of it.
They do that with Paul because Paul within Judaism is becoming the new thing. In fact, I have a couple of scholarly friends, I know a few of them, guys. I know you don't think I do, but let me tell you, I know a couple. And no, but seriously, they go to these seminars, and there will be the classical view of Paul, like what we're discussing on this show. Paul doesn't fit within Judaism. This is something weird and different. And but then there's like 3-4 people in there listening to the person at the seminar, like literally ghosted. But then someone like Paula Fredrickson, really, brilliant scholars, don't get me wrong, but Paula Fredrickson, other people within the Paul in Judaism school, the place, you got to stand up. There's no more seats to listen to them speak about this Paul within Judaism thing. And I've talked to a good buddy of mine, I'll leave unnamed, who said one of the leading proponents, who's a Jew, who came out with this, his ultimate intentions aren't, I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm not saying that they're not honorable, but I'm not sure it's completely about accuracy and absolutely trying to understand what Paul's saying. It's more ecumenical, like you said. How can we make Paul and Judaism hold hands, sing Kumbaya together? Let's get Christianity closer to Judaism and make this thing not second century Christianity. You know what I'm saying? Or,
in fact, there's an irony in that some of the people in this movement, I noticed this at the Jesus seminar, they'll, like E.P. Sanders, will say, it doesn't appear that Judaism at the time believed in some sort of salvation by works. But then some of the same people will say, but Paul did. that by grace, in faith, he meant just non-Torah observance for Gentiles. And so you're kind of arguing at cross purposes, though the motive is the same, to bring them together. And you're saying, well, okay, Jews didn't believe in works, but Paul did. Well, now how are you going to get them back together?
Right.
But it's obvious what's going on.
I don't know how. I don't understand. You know, I confess to you, I watch some of these scholars. You know, I try to stay with, you know, reading text, but when I read, I go, what are they reading? Like, Paul is addressing Jews on a number of occasions and includes himself when he says the law is over. Even in Galatians, he self-includes. In Romans 7, famous chapter, he's speaking to Jews, he ain't speaking to Gentiles. He's speaking to his fellow brethren.
Yeah,
he tells them if a woman is married and her husband dies, she is no longer bound by the marriage. She is free. And then Paul says something which I think reveals that Paul was definitely couldn't possibly be a Pharisee. In the same chapter, where he says something very striking.
Doesn't Paula Fredrickson say that only Paul wrote to Gentiles or something like that?
But the point is, he doesn't. It's just simply, right. You know, I want to urge the viewers to do this. Just one thing. And this read it for yourself. Really, like, go to the text. It's okay to read it for yourself. You know, the book of Mark is only 678 verses. It's like an hour and a half. Like, just read it. It's like, but people don't. I don't know why. They read these novels, but they read it up. There's no magic. There's nothing up my sleeve, nothing up to Dr. Price's sleeve. You just go back to the primary sources, read it for yourself. Another point here about Paul, which is part of this, is that if you grew up as an Orthodox Jew, as a Pharisaic Jew, that's all you know. That's all I knew growing up. I'm learning Hebrew before I learned English. That's your world. Your Torah, your observance, your relationship to God is everything. There is no other world. And it was very important to us to keep the outside world out where it belongs. Now, Paul says this very interesting thing in Romans 7, after urging Jews not to keep the law. He says something very interesting. He says, it's in Romans 7, 9, I don't know in front of me, it's right out there. He says that before he knew about the law, so he didn't know he was sinning, and I'm paraphrasing here, and I only realized that I was under the condemnation of the law when I learned the law. When did that happen? That means if you're really saying you're a Pharisee of Pharisees and you grew up in a religious Jewish home, there's no point you don't know what it says in the Torah that you shall not keep Shabbos, and then I didn't know there was a law about kosher rules. So that's why I'm saying to you, the viewer, don't be afraid. You know, just read it for yourself. Paul is speaking to Jews. Like, read the book of Romans. It's not difficult to understand. It's weavy, but you can get it. It's not really complicated what Paul's saying. But Paul is saying there was a point in his life that he didn't know about the law. And the law brought a curse into his life when he discovered that he was a sinner. And we can only speculate what that sin was that Paul was so tortured of, because Paul clearly was a tortured soul. And what sin was it? What was it about Paul, in his own estimation, made himself so unredeemable? I mean, that's another topic. But if he was a Pharisee, there's no point where you don't know about the law and then, there's the law. Oh, that means I'm a sinner. That is a dead giveaway that Paul wasn't a Pharisee, because that could have never happened. You know about the Torah when you're 3 years old. You know, don't do this on Shabbos. This isn't kosher. You can't do this on the Sabbath day, and you can't speak about someone else. So this is why I say to people, just read the text yourself. It's in there. This is not... there's no magic going on here. Just going to the original text.
Amen.
Sounds like, like you said, Paul may have not been a fish in water,
Yeah, the Ebionite belief that he was a failed convert to Judaism. and he just couldn't handle it, and left, and to take revenge on it, decided to start a new religion. And that at least would, I mean, it sort of sounds like polemical slander, but it does kind of fit with this idea of the law as a burden. Who would say that? Or Peter in Acts 15, we've never been able to bear this load. Would he say that as a devout Jew? That's obviously a Gentile contemplating becoming a full proselyte, or in Paul's case, failing at it.
If you guys recommended me to follow the Torah, I'm not going to lie. Like that, you are asking serious, life-changing, I may not be able to go through that without torturing myself to do it. But if I was born in the water...
Yeah, that's right.
It's like what I talked about with reading the New Testament. I can't see it the way that Rabbi does, or I didn't. I can actually now, but you talk to a fundamentalist Christian who has boundaries that they've set and what they're willingly allowed to think in terms of. They're not going to see what Rabbi's saying. They're not even going to be open-minded to it. But, you know, he's coming at it from a different angle. So I'm a fish in water, so to speak, with the Christianity view, and then Rabbi comes in with this and says anti-Semitism. I'm going, what do you mean? What do you mean? And then he has to explain it. Well, with this is right there, like you said in the text, Rabbi. How often do we get right past it and not think sociologically? Like in that time, do you think Gentiles would look at the law that way? Sure. Do you think Jews would? I just don't. I'm not going to say it couldn't be extremely Hellenistic Jews who were like, I'm enjoying once in a while skipping on kosher or something. But what's more likely? And I think I like that idea.
I need to just a moment. Religious Jews now and didn't, and I'll show you some in a moment. But religious Jews look at the Torah as a joy, as a delight. I have never had pork in my mouth. It never passed my lips. And it's disgusting to me. Tell you, to me, Shabbos is a joy, a real joy. Now, it's true. If I was living in a completely non-Jewish neighborhood, it would be very hard to find kosher food. I mean, but you don't do that. So to a Jew, it's a delight. Psalm 119, the longest chapter in the Bible, it's all about King David talking about how the Torah is a delight and salvation is far from the wicked, for they know not my law, verse 155. You ain't going to find that in the book of Galatians. So, I mean, Jews don't think that way. To them, it's mother's milk. For us, we're wrapped in the Torah and we love it and we love Shabbos. You know, for me, it's today all I do during the week is I can't wait for Shabbos to come. I can't wait for Friday. Here in Jerusalem, you know, there's a siren that goes off to light the Sabbath candles. Here in Israel, when it's time to light the Sabbath candles, ushering in the Sabbath, that's right before sunset, a siren goes off. A beautiful siren goes off. And all the Jews go and we take candles, we put it in I don't want to cry, but it's like the Sabbath, if you watch on Fiddler on the Roof, the Sabbath prayer. Well, you see, they're really, even though Anatevka is a fictitious place, Anatevka really is about Jewish communities. Suddenly it's Shabbos. It's time to light the Sabbath candles. We waited a whole week for this joy. The table's set up beautifully with wine for the Kiddush to sanctify the Sabbath, challah to make a blessing over it. And we're so full of joy that we can fulfill this. We can't wait for the next opportunity to perform another mitzvah, to make another bracha. This is the way religious have no clue. And to show this point, I want to illustrate this because you go, how do I know then was different now? You see that the Torah, of course, contains all these prohibitions about not eating that which is unclean, Leviticus 11, of course. But if you look throughout the entire corpus of the prophets, you'll see there's virtually never an instance that the prophets warn the Jews, excoriating them for eating non-kosher food. It's virtually unheard of. It literally doesn't exist. That means there were problems. In fact, the prophetic part of Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, is all about criticism. It is, we don't get nothing goes easy there. It's often been said that the prophets were either written by God or an anti-Semite. The Jews, it's very, 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 just take my word for it now. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Cheskel, very, very critical stuff, right? But if you look at what is the nature of what is the problem that they're addressing, it's never that you're not keeping Shabbos. With one or two exceptions, Nehemiah chapter 10 and 13, you have Jeremiah 17. It's very rare, and there's special circumstances. So you see that the Jews always loved to eat kosher. To eating a pig meant that you were so off the rails that you were gone. That means you converted out, you're a total apostate. And in fact, that's how, when Jews were forced to convert to Christianity by the church, whatever threatened, they had to eat pork to show the church that they really were. So Jews never had, right? They had to eat pork, and they had to eat on Yom Kippur, and the church was able to discover what the church called Marranos, conversos, forced Jews who became Christians but really were Jewish and secretly Jewish. They wanted to see on Yom Kippur, did they eat or not? To a Jew, we look forward to eating bacon to us is grotesque. And really, to me, I don't see a lobster in Israel. I remember in America, we'd be in a big supermarket, you'd see a fish tank with lobsters with rubber bands, and I'd say, hey, buddy, get out quick. You don't understand. This is not vacation. But to me, a lobster looks like a big cockroach. It's the most disgusting thing. I want to call an exterminator. So just to understand, you have to understand the world of the religious Jew. To us, it's a joy. It's a delight. It's kissing Hashem. We keep a mitzvah. There's no burden shmurden. That's all nonsense. It's all silliness. It's only the outsider would think that. The Jew never thinks that way.
You know, I think of second Maccabees, when the Seleucids are persecuting the Jews, and the horrifying story of the tortures inflicted on these 7 brothers and on the elder Eleazar, I think it is. They're saying, look, it's just a ham sandwich. Just take a bite and you can get out of here scot-free. And they won't do it because they're going to be, because that's symbolic of the whole thing. Like, oh, you mean apostatize from Judaism? No thanks.
Wow.
And it's not just a ham sandwich. I saw this thing on the Long Search, a PBS series where the reporter went around to different spots in the world and interviewed people in different religions. And one thing that really sticks in my mind, they're in Israel, and there's, I don't know if he's a rabbi or just a devout Jew, period, but he's in his home, and it's the Sabbath. And I love it because the dining room is lined with bookcases and books, and they're about to have the meal, and he says, look, the Sabbath isn't restrictive. It's freedom. You don't have to answer the phone with some nebbish bothering you, for instance. And I thought, yeah, that really does seem great. You talk about theology in the Bible. Yeah, that sounds great. So that at least sticks in my mind about how it would be a joy.
Rabbi, would you like to say some closing words?
I want to thank the both of you. I feel this is a very special, whatever it is, it's something very beautiful. And it shows that there could be light that comes out of darkness. That, you know, I won't hide it. I when I read the Gospels, I don't know what nothing comes through it. So much myth. When I read Paul, I encounter somebody I really dislike. But sometimes you can be in a place of darkness, and the literature of Paul is certainly a very dark place, but from it, light could emerge. And let's hope that from this discussion that light emerges from a very dark place. It's a real joy to spend this time with Dr. Price and with Derek, and I look forward to future broadcasts studying it. To the viewer, don't be afraid to go back to the original. Go back to the original text. Enjoy it. It's really quite a delight. Thank you.
Dr. Price?
Amen. I can only reiterate the same thing. It's just a great pleasure and a great honor.
Well, we admit that we always are a pleasure to be able to spend this time with the King of the Jews. I can tell you that much for sure. And seriously, there's a good friendship here, and that friendship means a lot. I always feel heart, felt and warm when we have these conversations, and I want to continue to have more of these. So I really do appreciate that.
Thank you. Shalom.
Yeah. Don't forget, guys, you want to go to heaven? Check it out. And don't forget this. We
are
Myth Vision. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure you guys join the Patreon to help Myth Vision grow and continue bringing you content like this. Like the video. Tell me what you think about it down below, and subscribe and hit that bell. Check out Dr. Robert M. Price's Patreon, as well as outreachjudaism.org. Love you guys.